A quiet stretch of woods near the Florida-Georgia line. Police standing over freshly disturbed soil. And a confession that would lead detectives to one of the most horrifying discoveries in modern American true crime. How did they end up here? That's the question that pulled detectives out of the station at midnight and into a hunt across state lines, and it's the question that would force a community to reckon with how trust can be weaponized. Carol and James Reggie Sumner were, by every outward measure, ordinary retirees married decades, living in Jacksonville, Florida, quietly managing health setbacks and a life built on small comforts. They were 61 years old in July 2005, frail, paying medical bills, and dependent in ways that made them especially vulnerable. They welcomed a familiar face into their home, someone they'd known before. That welcome would prove fatal. It began with a knock. A polite, rehearsed request to use a phone. Inside the house that night were two people who had trusted one another for years and four strangers who had coldly calculated that trust into opportunity. The intruders moved with a grim purpose. A toy gun, duct tape, and a practiced efficiency turned a domestic visit into a home invasion. Carol and Reggie were bound. Their bodies were forced into the trunk of their own Lincoln Town car, a car that would later become a central piece of evidence. The victims, already weakened by illness and injury, had almost no capacity to resist. What followed was a slow, deliberate transport north across the state line into Charlton County, Georgia, to a site that had been prepared in advance. The killers had not improvised. They had planned. 2 days before the visit to the Sumners' home, a shallow grave had been dug in southern Georgia. The ground there was soft and secluded, the kind of place people drive past without noticing unless they've been told to stop. According to investigators, the group forced the couple to reveal ATM pins, and jewelry and other valuables were collected and fenced. At the pre-dug site, the Sumners were placed into the pit alive. Medical examiners later determined the cause of death. Asphyxiation after dirt entered their airways, the terrifying signature of a death by burial while conscious. The deliberate nature of the act, the pre-dug grave, the taped mouths, the hollowed-out lungs transformed a robbery into something far darker. The first break came the way many do, a worried family member. The Sumners' daughter reported them missing. Detectives arrived at the Jacksonville home and found small but damning details, signs of a struggle, duct tape, a living room that no longer felt lived in. The couple's Lincoln was found abandoned several miles away, wiped down but not perfectly. A scrap of evidence here, fingerprints there, a blurred CCTV frame from an ATM camera, each tiny detail stacked until the picture became undeniable. Detectives ran prints, combed pawn records, and rebuilt the timeline of a few cold hours that would define everyone involved. This case would be solved not just by shoe prints or fingerprints, but by the blunt arithmetic of greed. Shortly after the Sumners vanished, unusual ATM withdrawals began to appear on the victims' accounts. Jewelry stolen from their home turned up pawned in nearby towns. Surveillance footage, grainy but conclusive, placed members of the group at ATM kiosks and pawnshops, using the Sumners' cards and selling their keepsakes. Those transactions created a digital breadcrumb trail that led investigators out of Jacksonville and toward the people who had exploited the Sumner trust. 4 names would come to dominate the case: a woman who had been known to the Sumners, and 3 men who had been recruited to carry out the plan. Arrests followed the financial evidence and witness leads. Some suspects were caught attempting to hide in hotels. Others gave conflicting accounts during interrogation. One detective's notebook entry reads like a lesson in human psychology. When you pressure a group of co-conspirators, their stories begin to fray at the edges. Friend turns on friend, small lies are enlarged, blame is shifted. That fray is exactly what investigators wanted. At first, the defendants pointed fingers at one another. Each tried to minimize their role. I didn't kill them, or I didn't know they would be buried. But the physical evidence, fingerprints on the duct tape, items from the Sumners' home among the suspects' possessions, kept the narrative tethered to reality. The turning point came when one man, young, implicated, and evidently wrestling with his conscience, agreed to lead detectives to what he knew. Bruce Nixon took law enforcement into the Georgia woods. It was July 15, 2005. when Nixon led officers to the shallow grave where the Sumners lay buried. The site was a patch of earth that told the story in a single, irrevocable sentence. 2 coffins of dirt, hastily filled, a pair of personal effects half buried, and the finality of human silence. Detectives say these are the moments that all the forensics and testimony prepare you for, and yet nothing prepares you for the weight of it. They began to dig. The air smelled of damp soil and motor oil. A shovel bit into the dirt and bit again. When the remains were uncovered, medical examiners confirmed the worst. The Sumners had been alive when they were buried and succumbed to asphyxiation. The crime could no longer be argued away as an accidental death or an unintended consequence. It was deliberate. The sound of spades, the hush of officers who have heard too many confessions to be surprised, the detective who closes his eyes and remembers the faces of victims he cannot bring back. They unearthed clothing, a pendant, and the small signatures of a life interrupted. The Sumners were removed with care. Even the procedural tenderness felt like an attempt at restitution. For those present, the discovery was more than confirmation of a crime. It was an answer to every sleepless night their loved ones had spent asking where they'd gone. The autopsy report, later entered into evidence, indicated that dirt had entered the airways, not merely that the victims had been unable to breathe after being covered, but that their final minutes were fought beneath a cold, foreign blanket of loam. The prosecution framed it bluntly: the grave had been the murder weapon. The trial unfolded like a slow-motion replay of every element detectives had pieced together. The home invasion, the trip to Georgia, the pre-dug grave, the ATM withdrawals, the pawnshop receipts, and then the confession that led them to the place where the Sumners' lives ended. All 4 defendants were convicted of first-degree murder, kidnapping, and robbery. Sentencing would vary and evolve. Appeals, resentencings, and judicial reviews stretched the process over years. One defendant received the death penalty, others were sentenced to life. Decades later, resentencing hearings and appeals continued to wind through the courts, each review reopening fresh pain for a family that had already lost everything. The woman who once shared a neighborly relationship with the victims, Tiffany Cole, was a focal point of public horror and courtroom attention. Her role, prosecutors argued, went beyond passive complicity. She helped plan, profit, and silence. In later years, the state re-examined sentences and jury recommendations, and the case continued to make headlines as appeals and resentencing caught up to the initial verdicts. This case wasn't solved by luck. It was solved by persistence, the tiny clues that refused to be scrubbed away, an ATM timestamp, the pawnshop ledger, fingerprints on duct tape, and crucially, one man's confession that cut through a web of lies and led detectives to the place the victims had been left to die. How does a person move from neighborly trust to participation in such cruelty? Was it greed, coercion, a fractured moral compass, or something deeper? The courtroom explained motive. It didn't explain the erosion of empathy that made this crime possible. In the end, the Sumner story is a study in betrayal. The people who walked away with their valuables also walked away from a last sliver of humanity. And for the detectives who dug, documented, and went to court for them, the case is a reminder that justice is a process, slow, imperfect, and often delayed, but that persistence can still force truth from the most carefully hidden places.